Welcome to the second week of the Berg lectures on Jewish identity at Mechon Hadar. For those of you who were not here last week, we extended our thanks and want to do so again to the Berg Foundation for making these lectures possible, and thank the students of Yeshivat Hadar for anchoring this space as a Makom Torah, a place of serious learning for the broader community. Last week we talked about the topic of Jewishness by blood, a quality that can neither be electively acquired nor electively shed. And tonight we're going to turn to the question of Jewishness by choice, the more porous aspect of Jewish identity, Judaism as a religion and a cultural practice, one that could be abandoned even by a blue blood who might be able to trace her ancestry all the way back to Abraham himself, and one that can be embraced by someone who only first learned of the existence of Jews the day before. I want to begin from two quotes from the Torah. Pen yesh bachem ish o isha o mishpacha o shevet, asher levavo foneh hayom me'im Adonai Eloheinu lalechet la'avod et Elohei hagoyim ahem. Pen yesh bachem shoresh poreh rosh ve'la'ana, ve'haya b'shomo et divrei ha'ala hazot ve'hitbarech bilvavo lemor, shalom yihyeli, ki bishrirut libi elech, למען שפות הרבה את הצמאה. לא יובא אדוני סלוח לו. כי אז ישן אף אדוני וקנאתו באיש ההוא, ורב צבו כל העלה הכתובה בספר הזה, ומחה אדוני את שמו מתחת השמיים. והבדילו אדוני לרעה מכל שבטי ישראל, ככל עלות הברית הכתובה בספר התורה הזה. Dvarim, Deuteronomy chapter 29, not in the sources in front of you, talking about the future, after many years after the covenant that Moshe settles with the people, perhaps there will be one among you, an individual, a family, an entire tribe, who will turn away from Adonai our God to go and worship other gods. And when this person or this family or this entire tribe hears the words of the curses in this Torah applied to someone who will violate its terms, they will think to themselves, it's fine. I can do whatever I want. It is my individual choice. God will not forgive such a person because God's anger will be kindled with that person, and all of the curses and oaths laid out in this book will devolve upon them, and God will erase their name from underneath the heavens. God will separate them out for bad from all of the tribes of Israel, according to all of the terms of this covenant written in this book. Quote 1. Quote 2. Torah achat yihyeh la'ezrach v'lager hagar betochachem. There shall be one law for the citizen and for the stranger who dwells among you. These two quotes contribute to our conversation about whether it is possible truly to enter and to leave Judaism. The first quote from Dvarim makes very clear, it seems, that it is impossible to leave. Someone is not able to say, I am the descendant of Abraham, but nonetheless I decide I do not wish to be bound by the terms of the covenant. And someone who says that and decides that they have the autonomous power to do what they wish will ultimately be called to account by God and by the terms of the Torah. That pulls us in a direction of Judaism as a non-negotiable, ethnically inherited identity. And then on the other hand, we have the notion that someone who is not of the children of Israel, someone who is a stranger dwelling in their midst, can somehow find themselves subject to the exact same law as those who were born into that people. Now, before we proceed into really delving into this topic, we have to get a little bit of background and understanding how did we end up where we are today. It's important to note and to assert very clearly that in the first temple period, it was not possible to separate ethnicity from religion. The ethnicity of what it meant to be an Israelite was bound up inextricably with what Israelite religion was. Israelite religion was simply the cultural manifestation of Israelite ethnicity. Conversion into that religion was just as impossible as it would be for me to convert to become ethnically Chinese. Part of what it meant to be an Israelite was to be the son or daughter of Israelites. And therefore, that essential identity was a hereditary, tribal, clan-based identity where each nation and each people has their own God and their own religion that is simply an extension of the people itself. In the first source on your sheet, we see this very strikingly in the dialogue between the Shofet Yiftach from the period of the Judges and his interlocutors of the people of Ammon. And he's arguing with them about a certain piece of land. And he has no problem saying that the God of Israel has dispossessed the Amorites from before his people Israel. Should you possess them? You possess that which Chemosh, your God, gives you to possess, and we possess that which Adonai, our God, gives us to possess. Each nation has its own God. The God is merely an extension of the national identity, the national essence. There is no sense of a religion into which one can enter without entering into the people. And since the people is fundamentally an ethnic category, there is therefore also no way of entering into the people. And if you look throughout the Bible, of all of the First Temple sources, it's very clear. There are people who are Israelites, and then there are the strangers that dwell among them. And in fact, the plain sense of the verse that I just read is that you establish one law, at least civilly, for the stranger and for the Israelite citizen, precisely because the stranger can never become an Israelite citizen. The stranger can no more become an Israelite citizen than we today could talk about switching ethnicities by a voluntary act. Okay? That is the background of the First Temple. I don't think we should even call it Judaism, but Israelite heritage that begins this conversation. It is a non-porous boundary defined by national ethnic lines. Now, there begin in Second Temple sources to be some beginning thoughts of change in this regard and what that model might look like. In a number of sources, I brought one of them here from the book of Esther. We hear about a group of people known as Nilvim, those who somehow find a way to kind of join in with, glom onto the Jewish people. And we find here, among other things, that the religious practices that Mordechai and Esther are taking on for the Jewish people and Zar'am, their bloodline descendants, they are also taking on for those who will somehow join them more broadly. And this category begins to appear, the notion of people who attach themselves to the people Israel. The real challenge, though, comes when Alexander the Great shows up on the scene and conquers the known world. And what that conquest introduces to the world is the notion of what we take for granted today as citizenship. The notion that there would be no longer just a Greek city-state made up of Greeks, ethnic national Greeks, but a Greek culture and Greek civilization that could actually take over broad swaths of the known world, and people not of Greek ethnic extraction could nonetheless live Greek lives, dress like Greeks, speak the Greek language, and adopt a Greek constitution. This completely shifts the notion of belonging from the ancient world as being about either part of a clear nation group and perhaps visiting in the territory of another, to the idea that we might construct an empire that has rules of citizenship that transcend ethnicity. That spawned a crisis for Judaism from which we have never recovered until this day. Because Judaism began in the world of a First Temple reality where ethnicity and religion could not be cleaved one from the other, and then found itself crossing the Hellenistic boundary into a world in which, on some level, it had to make a choice. Was Judaism going to continue to be an ethnic group, but one that would not ultimately necessarily determine religious and cultural practices, just as someone who lived in Persia could decide to become a cultural and religious Greek? Or was Judaism going to take a turn and actually become a culture, a civilization, an empire, if you will, of its own, freed from the bonds of ethnicity, but ultimately taking on a religious and substance and mission-based identity. Now, Second Temple Judaism was filled with a lot of struggle over this point and a number of different models. I think it's fair to say that the remnants of what we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the communities represented there are closer to the model of what it would mean to hold on to the ethnic essence of Judaism. A small group of people who ultimately take their bloodline extremely seriously, isolate themselves from the rest of society, have no pretense of having a broad impact beyond their little enclaves, and as a result maintain a kind of deep continuity with that aspect of the Israelite past. On the other hand, you have here another source. I've brought you source 3, the response of another Jew who said, "For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, neither is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God." Paul of Tarsus fundamentally looked at the Hellenistic world and said, the response of Judaism to the Hellenistic world is to completely dissolve the Judaism of the flesh and of the ethnos that had defined it before Alexander's conquest, and it has to be transformed into a new covenant that is as open to Gentiles as it is to Jews, and as he says, is ultimately one in the spirit as opposed to in the flesh. As should not surprise you, Rabbinic Judaism chose neither of these extremes, but left us with enough confusion that we have a good 40-50 minutes to have an interesting lecture. The fundamental decision, and this is what I want to suggest is the fulcrum off of which everything else turns, that Rabbinic Judaism made, was to allow conversion to Judaism. And to sum up that process, I think it's fair to say it involves taking on a Jewish body, the requirements of circumcision and immersion, accepting one's place in Jewish history, the first thing that is said to the convert upon them expressing interest, and then committing oneself to the core of Jewish religious practice. That decision fundamentally made a call that Judaism would not, going forward, be defined by ethnicity alone. But 2 points were left unresolved. 1, to what extent do converts to Judaism become the equals of those who were born Jewish? And 2, to what extent is there a corollary phenomenon such that one who abandons Jewish practice forfeits their essential Jewish identity? We know that Rabbinic Judaism made the strategic choice to allow people to become Jewish and to convert in, but those 2 other key questions were left unresolved, and that's what we will play out for the rest of the evening. I am going to posit for you tonight as a fundamental organizing principle for thinking about the rabbinic conversation going forward from the rejection of, let's say, Paul and the Dead Sea models and the acceptance of conversion as an initial step to tackling this problem, this challenge of Alexander, 2 fundamental strains of thought that run through all of rabbinic theology and halakha from that time until the present. And they are essentially the pole of thinking about Judaism as an ethnic identity, and on the other hand, the pole of thinking about Judaism as a religious identity. Sources that fundamentally express an ethnic perspective run throughout the entire conversation, and at almost every turn are countered by, complicated by, complemented by those sources that take a much more religious definition of what lies at the essence of Judaism. So let's begin with the ethnic strand of our conversation. Ethnic sources, even if they must acknowledge the possibility and validity of conversion, ultimately take a dim view of the process and those who go through it. On Yevamot 48b, source 5, we find 4 early rabbinic voices reacting to a perceived disproportionate share of suffering that was meted out to converts to Judaism in their own day, presumably at the hands of Gentile authorities. One voice in this text suggests that converts suffer because they don't even keep the basic Noahide laws that form the basis for civilized society. In other words, they're essentially rotten people who couldn't even follow the minimal standards demanded of them as Gentiles, but nonetheless proceeded to take on a more robust Jewish obligation. Another voice says that their suffering is rooted in the convert's ability to master the fine details of mitzvot, which would have been known more intuitively to a Jew by birth. A third view in that text critiques what he observes as their culture of serving God out of fear as opposed to out of love. And the final view blames them for waiting so long to convert in the first place. Now, these reasons are not so much hard sociological and historical analysis as I think they are organic reactions and expressions of deep resistance to the notion of conversion in the first place, and whether in fact it can be effective. And this is totally sensible against the biblical background where the notion of conversion is on some level impossible. In another Talmudic passage, Rav opines in a similar vein that even the 10th generation descendant of a convert cannot truly be trusted to own the Jewish story as his exclusive narrative and can be expected to display ongoing sympathies with the Gentile world and its concerns. Other sources emphasize that Israel's connection to prophecy and the divine presence is in fact limited to its blue bloods. In source 6, we have Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in 12th century Spain spelling this out, and he writes, "Now, we do not allow anyone who embraces our religion theoretically by means of words alone to take equal rank with ourselves. The convert must adopt our mode of life. God allows him who treads this path, as well as his progeny, to approach him very closely. Those, however, who become Jews do not take equal rank with born Jews, who are specially privileged to attain to prophecy, whilst the former can only achieve something by learning from them, and can only become pious and learned, but never prophets." This way of thinking prompted Rabbi Chelbo, a sage from the land of Israel in the 3rd century of the Common Era, to say, "Converts are as terrible for Israel as a rash." Rabbis more sympathetic to converts in later generations tried very hard to reinterpret this source, which is a fascinating story in and of itself, suggesting that converts were terrible to Israel because the Torah warns Jews not to afflict gerim, not to afflict converts, the strangers that become the antecedents to what we talk about as converts. But Jews are never able to live up to that task, and so the converts are a constant stumbling block for them. Others tried to suggest that converts were more observant than native Jews and thus made the latter look bad. Still others argued that the Jewish exile was a product of divine desire to attract converts from all the nations of the world, and thus the institution of conversion hangs like a political albatross around the necks of Jews who are destined to be dispersed because of it. But all of those, I think it's fair to say, are post facto attempts to escape the plain sense of Rabbi Chelbo, which is that converts dilute the Jewish people and threaten its connection with God, which is, according to this view, anchored in the carnal election of the Jewish people. Rabbi Chelbo's approach is in keeping with a Talmudic statement that predicts doom for anyone who facilitates conversions, and one that shockingly lists converts together with pedophiles as among those who delay the coming of the Messiah. Now, this ethnic theology of Jewish peoplehood has an ethnic halacha that goes with it. Consider the laws of marriage. Rabbi Yosei, an early rabbinic sage, permits a convert to marry a mamzer, a person of tainted lineage, who is forbidden from marrying a Jew not similarly tainted. And while it's taken for granted that converts are generally allowed to marry Jews by birth, early voices in the Mishnah spar over the possibility of converts and their descendants marrying into priestly families of Kohanim. Rabbi Yehuda rules that any woman who descends patrilineally from a convert, even 100 generations after the conversion, is barred from marrying a Kohen. Even Rabbi Shimon, who rules that those converted as infants and toddlers can marry Kohanim, concedes that someone who becomes Jewish as an adult cannot marry into a priestly family. In the context of the bluest of the blue bloods in Jewish life, Kohanim, the presence of the non-Jewish ancestry distinctive of converts is simply too much to bear. In 1935, to jump far into the future, the leaders of the Syrian Jewish community in America issued a decree forbidding anyone in their community to marry anyone born as a Gentile, irrespective of whether there was conversion, an effective ban on conversion in that community. Other rabbinic authorities, while conceding that marriage between a Jew by birth and a convert is permitted, warn starkly against its advisability. You have the proclamation of the Syrian community in 7, which I encourage you to look at after, but in source 8, we hear from Rav Menashe Klein, a contemporary rabbinic legal authority in the United States, who puts it this way. Obviously, one must love converts and draw them near. The Torah commanded in various ways, in 48 different places, to draw them near and not to hurt them. Nonetheless, with respect to arranging marriages, one should not mix with them, because obviously if a family mixes with them, the divine presence will no longer dwell on that family, and therefore they are as terrible for Israel as a rash. And it is obvious that when it comes to converts, it makes no difference if the person is a righteous convert and observes everything, lest you think his concern here is one of lack of commitment. Nonetheless, one should not mix with them even today, unless you say, but that doesn't make any sense. Everyone has converts somewhere back in their family. We don't say, since so many converts have already mixed into the Jewish people over time, it doesn't matter anymore, and all are permitted to marry. Certainly, it would be terrible for any family of pure lineage to be matched up with a convert. Now, many sources beyond the realm of marriage have a further kind of manifestation of this ethnic halacha. The eligibility of converts to serve as Jewish leaders. The Mishnah, while seeming to permit converts to serve as judges, forbids them to try capital cases. In Talmud Bavli Kiddushin, Rav Yosef reports a tradition that converts are not to be appointed to any position of Jewish political power, whether it be the monarchy or even the mayor of a town. And some extended this to reinterpret the Mishnah as banning converts from serving in any judicial capacity unless they could demonstrate some Jewish lineage in their past. Even in the realm of liturgy, converts were not always allowed to use the same texts that Jews by birth used to describe their ancestral past. The Mishnah bans converts from reading the biblical passage that is said in conjunction with bringing the first fruits to the temple, part of which we read at the Seder, Arami Oved Avi. Why? Because they cannot speak of the land of Israel as a place that God swore to our ancestors. Further, when a convert prays, the Mishnah prescribes that he not say Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu, but Elohei avot Yisrael, the God of the ancestors of Israel, directing him to speak of the Jewish past in the third person rather than first person terms. Centuries later, Rabbeinu Tam in medieval France prevented converts from leading Birkat HaZimun, the invitation to the grace after meals, because they would not be able to speak about the land given to the Jewish people in the first person, the key element of the second blessing. And later, in the German town of Würzburg, converts were forbidden from leading communal prayers in line with this Mishnah. Now, this approach to converts has many things that I think rub us in a very uncomfortable way for reasons we'll get to when we explore the other mode of thinking about Jewish identity. But I think it's important to understand where it comes from. A lot of it retreads ground from last week that I don't want to go over again. But you have to take seriously the notion that to the extent that Jewish bloodline, Jewish heredity, the idea of anchoring the covenant in a familial structure has any power or weight, it is understandable, I'm not saying whether it's appealing or justifiable, but it is understandable that one of the responses to that would be some degree of distancing of those who are laterally entering that conversation as opposed to being the organic vertical continuation of it. Now, this ethnic halacha has ramifications not only for converts, but for apostates as well. And this is where it starts to get interesting. The deep connection to blood ties that make the marginalization of the convert possible, if not necessary, also allows for claiming that even the most wayward Jews remain in the fold. Right? If the religious behavior and commitment of converts is still insufficient to guarantee them total equality with born Jews, according to this strand, then it stands to reason that the abandonment of Jewish practice would not strip someone of their Jewish birthright. And there is, in fact, a strong strain of ethnic halacha surrounding apostasy as well. Shmuel rules in the Talmud Bavli in Chulin that a Jew who worships idols, may slaughter meat for other Jews, even though ritual slaughter cannot be done by a Gentile. This Jew's abandonment of Jewish practice and adoption of another religion does not change his fundamental identity. The narrative language expressing this legal position is Chata Yisrael, Afal pi shechata Yisraelhu. Even when a Jew sins, she is still a Jew. Now, the practical ramifications of this refusal to separate religion from ethnicity are significant. The Talmud states in more than one place that Jewish apostates, despite their practices, and by apostate here I mean a range of interpretation of what it means to abandon Jewish practice. It could be anything from someone who has a specific set of practices that they have thrown out to someone who has actively converted to another religion. Apostates, despite their practices, can contract Jewish marriages with observant Jews as opposed to Gentiles who cannot legally affect Jewish marriage. This approach reaches an almost absurd zenith with Rav Asi's statement that in light of the many Jews from the 10 lost tribes who may be mixed in with the general population, if a Gentile betroths a Jewish woman in Babylonia, one must be strict and require a Jewish divorce before the woman is allowed to remarry. In other words, even a man who is identified as a Gentile by practice and by social association may be a Jew by blood. And that is the key factor for determining his Jewish identity. Rabbi Menachem HaMeiri in 14th century Provence is one of many medieval authorities to state that even a Jew who has adopted another religion remains a Jew for the purposes of marriage and divorce. The Magid Mishneh, Rav Vidal de Tolosa of 14th century Spain, pushed this even further. The child of two Jewish apostates remains a Jew for the purposes of contracting Jewish marriage. In other words, the Christian-raised child of two Jews who converted to Christianity does not need to convert before marrying a Jewish woman. That is ethnic apostasy halacha. Now, while this ethnic approach to Jewishness is inclusive in a sense, it allows Jews to remain Jews irrespective of their religious choices, it has serious consequences when the personal status of one Jew ends up affecting the status of another person. So let's take the example of levirate marriage. The Torah rules that when a man dies childless, his brother, known as his lever, must marry his widowed sister-in-law or release her from the levirate bond through a ritual known as chalitza. In source 9, Rav Paltoy Gaon, early medieval authority, is the first to engage the case of a lever, a brother-in-law, who is an apostate, living in this case as a Muslim, in Muslim society, and behaving like a Muslim. How should this woman, the Jewish woman left behind, remarry, given that her brother-in-law has left Judaism entirely? Rav Paltoy Gaon's answer is unequivocally ethnic. This woman must wait forever, and there is no solution for her until the apostate performs chalitza. Since the apostate was conceived and born in a state of Jewishness, she is attached to him, and she cannot be released without chalitza. Rashi affirms this approach as well, and the strongest statement in this regard comes in source 10 from Rav Yosef Karo in his monumental work, the Beit Yosef. He says, "It is clearly correct that a woman is bound to an apostate lever even if the husband betrothed her after his brother apostatized. And all of his descendants, even for many generations, even if they remain apostates, as long as they have Jewish mothers, even if they are apostates, their kiddushin are valid and their wives are bound to levers." This ethnic halacha, at its purest, simply ignores the religious choices of Jews as having anything to do with their identity, which is fundamentally fixed by blood. In one early medieval responsum, a Gaon is asked whether a Jew who converted to another religion and who then wants to return to Judaism must immerse in a mikvah to reestablish himself as a Jew. Do you need to convert on the way back in after you converted out? And the answer, which you have in source 11, no immersion is required. He is not a convert. A convert requires immersion to emerge from a Gentile state, since he was conceived and born in that state. But this Jew was conceived and born as a Jew and need not immerse. Even a convert who has been circumcised and has immersed, who then reverts to non-Jewish practice and then returns to Jewish practice, does not require immersion. Even the one who actually took on Jewish identity midlife, that Jewish identity becomes completely non-negotiable. Now here we see played out not only the theory of carnal Jewishness, but also the understanding I was arguing for last time of conversion as the acquisition of a Jewish body and a Jewish genetic line. If the acts of circumcision and immersion were understood here by the Gaon as a mere physical focusing points for taking on a life of Jewish commitment, there is no reason why they would not have to be permitted after that commitment was clearly seen to have totally lapsed. But if they are the hallmarks of taking on a Jewish body, then it possibly makes sense to say that this convert has now been made a Jew by blood in a certain sense. In the words of Rav Moshe Feinstein, who spoke the clear language of ethnic identity halacha in source 12, the reason it is totally obvious to the Gemara that an apostate is a bona fide Jew in all respects is because there is no sense to a reality in which a Jew could become a Gentile. When a Gentile becomes a Jew, there's a new aspect of the Torah added to his life, such that he can become a Jew through conversion. But nowhere in the Torah, not in the verses, nor in the oral tradition at Sinai, is there a notion that a Jew can become a Gentile. He always remains a Jew, whether with respect to mitzvot or with respect to marriage and lineage. And therefore, clearly the children of female apostates are bona fide Jews. Now, all of this fits very well with the discussion we had last week, reflecting on the ways in which Jewishness is carnal and is grounded in the family of Avraham. The non-negotiability of the covenant between God and Israel is mirrored by the non-negotiability of descent, the ways in which no matter how much children might come to hate their parents, their biological link to them can never be severed. And this is one way of answering Alexander the Great's challenge. We are a people defined by ancestry. True, as a people we receive the Torah, and we have always had a rich set of religious practices, but we retain our tribal and national identity from antiquity, and aside from a few converts here and there, that clan structure defines our essence until the present. But there's another way to think about all of this, one that takes the consequences of the institution of conversion much more seriously. I mentioned last week at some length Michael Wyshegrad's book, The Body of Faith. Between the first and second versions of that book, Wyshegrad's readers confront his theory of God's election of a specific people with the problem posed by the pathway into religion that is not acquired by birth, conversion. How can the essence of Judaism be bodily, they say to Wyshegrad, if it is possible to become a Jew without being born one? Wyshegrad addresses this fly in his ointment by describing conversion as, quote, a miracle, and a phenomenon small in scope that is barely a rounding error on the numbers of the main body of the people of Israel as descended from Abraham. The anomaly is thus dismissed, and the paradigm, he claims, can survive. I'm not sure, however, that that does conversion full justice. First, Wyshegrad, for his own purposes, unfortunately, overlooks the fact that conversion itself is a bodily process, and thus might not be as removed from his theory as he thinks. But conversion requires more than that. It is also grounded in Torah and mitzvot, the acceptance of core Jewish practices, and the claim that these two are somehow essential elements of being a Jew. One who takes conversion seriously as an alternate way of acquiring Jewish identity will not only tend towards the equal treatment of Jews by blood and Jews by choice, but will also have to think differently about apostasy. Because if Jewish identity can truly be put on like a new piece of clothing, then it stands to reason that it can be taken off as well. If blood is not a prerequisite for Jewishness, neither should it be a guarantee. This is more than a fly in Wishegrad's ointment. This is an anomaly that can threaten to throw his entire theory into crisis and to precipitate a paradigm shift for thinking about Jewish identity. A number of core rabbinic texts reflect just that paradigm shift and that perspective on conversion. On Talmud Bavli Kreitot 9a, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi does something amazing. He imagines the conversion process as including circumcision, immersion, and sacrifice, not in the packet in front of you. Why does he do that? Because converts, he says, are compared to born Jews. Just as the ancestors of pure-blood Jews entered into the covenant at Sinai through circumcision, immersion, and sacrifice, so too all future converts. What's so striking about this text is that it turns all born Jews into the descendants of converts. Right? Fundamentally turns everyone who is Jewish into the descendant of a convert at some point, which levels the playing field fundamentally between these two groups. One of them just has a head start over the other. That trend is continued in texts like Vayikra Rabbah, where Rabbi Abahu says that converts to Judaism become a part of the trunk of the tree that is Israel, not just extensions of its branches. And Reish Lakish, in source 13, takes this to its highest rhetorical place with the following offering. The convert is more beloved than Israel when they stood at Sinai. Why? Had Israel not seen thunder and lightning, trembling mountains and ram's horns, they never would have accepted the Torah. Yet this convert never saw any of those things and came and completed himself through God, accepting divine sovereignty. Could there be anyone more beloved than that? Now, this approach to conversion has its practical ramifications as well and produces its own religious identity, halacha, as opposed to the ethnic halacha that we saw in the first piece. There were authorities who forbade converts from marrying mamzerim, subjecting them to the same rules as any other Jew in this regard. In one place, Rashi explains the ban on converts marrying Kohanim as being specifically about the sexual promiscuity of Gentile culture at the time of Chazal, arguing that the ban is not ontological and essential, but rather sociological and contextual, and thus potentially open to revisiting in a different context. Some of the most striking data in this regard, though, in this strand, relate to the question of liturgy that we raised briefly before. In the Talmud Yerushalmi, which you have in source 14, Rabbi Yehuda rejects the ruling preserved in the Mishnah about the reading that the convert is banned from doing in the temple, and rules that a convert reads the biblical passage associated with the first fruits as would any other Jew. Why? Because God said to Avraham, Av hamon goyim nitaticha. I have made you the father of many nations. In the past, you were a father of Aram. From now on, you are a father to all the nations. In other words, Rabbi Yehuda redefines the Abrahamic covenant in defiance of Wishegard. There's an anachronism for you. This was not ever intended, says Rabbi Yehuda, to be a love fest between God and a single human family. Rather, Avraham was set up by God as a paradigm for others in the future to follow, a group that includes, but is not limited to, his direct descendants. Rabbi Yehuda's position and its corollary holding that a convert can say any prayer that talks about Jewish ancestry became dominant in Eretz Yisrael just a few generations later. Despite the fact that the Babylonian Talmud seems to have continued the Mishnah's tradition on this point and to have been unaware of Rabbi Yehuda's dissenting view, later authorities followed the Yerushalmi's lead. In medieval France, Rabbi Yitzchak of Dampierre ruled in favor of converts leading the grace after meals in opposition to Rabbeinu Tam, and Rabbi Yoel Halevi became the advocate for convert prayer leaders in Germany. But But the most amazing chapter in this story comes when Rambam, when Maimonides engages the question of a rabbinic colleague, himself a convert, who was unsure as to how he should pray. Rambam not only follows the Yerushalmi in treating converts as the liturgical equals of Jews by birth, but he offers a philosophical and theological frame that makes clear just how radical the notion of conversion is. Source 15 on your sheets. You asked regarding the blessings and prayers, whether in private or communal prayer. Should you say, Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu, and who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us, and who has separated us, and Asher Bachar Banu, and who gave inheritance to our ancestors, Asher Hotzianu Mimitzrayim, and who performed miracles for our ancestors, and all similar formulations. You should say them all exactly as they are, Maimonides writes. Do not change a thing. Just as any citizen of Israel would pray and bless, so it is appropriate for you to bless and pray, whether in private or whether you are leading the community. The core point is that Avraham, our father, is the one who taught and educated the people, informing them of the religious truth and the unity of God, rejecting idols and their worship. He brought many into the divine presence and taught, instructed, and commanded his descendants to follow God's way, as it is said in the Torah, for I have singled him out, that he may instruct his children and his posterity to keep the way of the Lord. Therefore, anyone in any generation who converts, and anyone who unifies God's name, as is written in the Torah, is a student of Avraham, our father, and a member of his household. And Avraham himself is responsible for setting him on the right path, just as he did to the people of his own generation. Avraham, our father, is thus the father to all of his descendants who properly follow his example, and also a father to all of his students and to any future convert. Therefore you should say, our God and God of our ancestors, for Avraham is your father. And you should also say, who gave inheritance to our ancestors, for the land was given to Avraham. But with respect to who took us out of Egypt, or who performed miracles for our ancestors, you may change this if you wish to the third person, but if you did not change these phrases, nothing is lost. Since once you have come into the divine presence, there is no longer any difference between us and you. And of the miracles that happened are as if they has happened to you and to us and to you as well. There is no difference between us and you with respect to anything. And you certainly should say, Asher Bachar Banu and Asher Natan Lanu, et Torah, because God has already chosen you and separated you from the nations and given you the Torah. Now, considering the implications of this, it's actually almost hard to imagine that Rambam believes what he says here. Because if you take it seriously, it's essentially to say that our discourse around the Jewish past is entirely mythical and not historical. Once we made the decision as a people to accept converts, we inexorably broke our bond to any serious ethnic conception of Judaism. Even our seemingly bedrock historical claims about the Exodus from Egypt, for example, are not, according to Rambam, empirical claims about the past, but rather narratives we sign on to, such that a convert can say, yes, that happened in my past as well. That is the pinnacle of a religious identity halacha around conversion. Now, as was the case with the ethnic strand of the tradition, the religious strand has corollaries for how we treat apostates as well. And we get a hint of this in Rambam's opaque formulation, Nimtza Avraham Avinu alav hashalom hu av lizar'o haksherim haholchim bidrachav. Avraham, our father, is thus the father to all of his descendants who properly follow his example. The implication here is pretty clear. Jews who don't follow the religious principles and laws that Avraham's descendants were supposed to follow are not truly his descendants, i.e., they are not Jews. That notion that someone with Jewish blood can nonetheless forfeit their citizenship in the Jewish people by dint of abandoning Jewish practice is well attested and strongly represented in our tradition. And by the time I'm done with this, maybe you'll think the ethnic model looks a little more attractive than you originally thought. The first inkling that we get of such a possibility is the ruling in the Tosefta that those who publicly desecrate Shabbat are treated like Gentiles for the purpose of making a communal Eruv, the shared communal Shabbat space that requires Jewish buy-in and participation on a number of details. Another Talmudic passage makes clear that apostates to idolatry and public desecrators of Shabbat are barred from bringing sacrifices to the temple, and this produces a ruling in contrast to Shmuel, who we cited above, that meat slaughtered by an idolatrous Jew is unfit for Jewish consumption. Other passages imagine entire classes of people, such as Samaritans and descendants of the 10 lost tribe, being simply voted out of the Jewish people, not because of questions surrounding their lineage, but because of proof that they had become full-blown idolaters. In other words, these texts see Jewish practice as the serious litmus test of Jewish identity. Rambam's lofty and inspiring language regarding converts means on some level that one cannot seriously regard those with Jewish blood but who violate core Jewish practices as being truly Jewish. Several practical rulings clarify this direction of thought. A number of Provençal rabbis, cited by both the Itur and the Meiri, ruled in the 12th and 13th centuries that one who violates Shabbat in public is a Gentile and is incapable of affecting Jewish marriage. That's source 16. Consider the import here. This is not an exhortation not to marry such a person. This is a claim that it is legally impossible. And what is the proof text? Oti beini uvenechem. Shabbat is a sign between God and the Jewish people, read here as the sign of whether someone is a Jew is whether they keep Shabbat. Religious practice is not in this formulation an obligation that devolves upon a particular ethnic group of Jews. It's rather the very essence that makes them a part of that group in the first place. There were others who found it similarly absurd to prevent a woman whose lever had converted to another religion to allow him to destroy the possibility of her having a future Jewish family. And so Rabbi Yehuda Gaon and others ruled, no levered bond exists between a woman and a brother-in-law who had adopted another faith. And some later authorities even suggested that this view would negate the levirate bond even if the brother-in-law only apostatized after the initial marriage. In effect, these views are claiming that conversion to another religion, and potentially the abandonment of core Jewish practices more generally, is a kind of death that ought to have legal consequences equal and opposite to the process of conversion. So it's not surprising, therefore, that we find various medieval sources prescribing various rituals for returning apostates. In sources 17 and 18, you can see these. While the formal rulings of almost all authorities are that no conversion is required, they seem to end up requiring procedures such as immersion in a mikvah and acceptance of mitzvot in front of a Jewish court of 3. Does that sound familiar to you? Sounds like conversion. If one can sign up to be a full Jew, then it would seem that full Jews have the legal capacity to submit their resignations. And among more recent rabbinic figures, Rabbi Yehuda Yakuti el-Halberstam, a 20th century authority in Israel, has written at length about the firm grounding for the view that an apostate Jew is a Gentile in all respects and would require full-blown conversion upon return. For Rav Halberstam, many of the secular Israelis who lived near him were really no different on the religious plane from the Muslim and Christian Arabs who might seem to the outsider to be so much farther away. Because when one's gaze turns from ethnicity to religion, even one's brother can become a total stranger. This, then, is the alternative answer to Alexander the Great's challenge. We are a religion, originally anchored in a specific people, but one that rises and falls on Torah and mitzvot, and whose boundaries are defined by choosing practice rather than by inheriting blood. A lot closer, in certain ways, to Paul's vision in Romans than the first model that we played out. Now, as part of wrapping this up, there are a number of limitations as we consider how do we take these two strands, which run through this corpus, and think about the ways in which some kind of synthesis emerges from them. And it's important, I think, to lay out what is the limitation of the possible in any serious rabbinic discourse. The first is that one can only with great difficulty, as has the Syrian community in this country, reject the strategic decision to allow conversion as a pathway into Jewish citizenship. That is to say, that's almost impossible to do in any authentic way as a rabbinic Jew. And even authorities like the Syrian rabbinic leadership are ultimately making a statement about social policy and a tactical refusal to accept converts at specific points in history. No rabbinic Jew can deny the theoretical legal effectiveness of a conversion to turn a Gentile into a Jew, even if that Jew is laden with social and legal stigmas that might prevent that person from ever becoming the true equal of a born Jew. But such a person, according to everyone in this conversation, is a Jew nonetheless. And that reality must on some level affect our understanding of the essence of every other Jew everywhere. Second is, I am not aware of any group of Jews that is willing to say that being born to two Jewish parents does not, at least by default, establish you as a Jew. And until such time as you produce an example for me, I will feel comfortable in saying no one is actually willing to go full-blown with the religious identity model of halakha on these points. There is also no way of imagining a rabbinic conversion ceremony that suffices with a declaration of faith and commitment alone. Such a ceremony is completely divorced from the entire rabbinic conversation around conversion. And we see there, too, the embodied piece of this coming back. Even rabbinic sources that acknowledge another limitation and even advocate for the legal significance of apostasy after the fact do not, and I think could not, offer the abandonment of Jewish practice as an elective option for those born as Jews. And that goes back to the passage from Dvarim that I began with. There is an essential piece of the biblical and rabbinic notion of covenant that has an element of non-negotiability that is not simply the elective equivalent of our other social associations. And one cannot, in that sense, truly embrace the religious identity model of Judaism without, I think, on some level slipping into a version of Pauline Christianity. Now, that said, the other limitation is, it seems pretty clear that the ethnic model is bound to fade in our contemporary, increasingly post-ethnic society. And if we assume for a moment that history is not going to suddenly turn on a dime, which it might, if we woke up and in short order Jews were suddenly being treated as an ethnic group and being persecuted as such, the whole thing can turn on its head. But in the place where we sit now, we live in a society that is undermining ethnicity and undermining that basis of identity. And therefore, the real question is, what is an increasingly post-ethnic trending towards, even though it will never totally get there, religious identity potentially look like in terms of Jewish identity and descent? So I end with three provocative sources for thinking about ways that we might achieve such a synthesis, which are all works in progress in my head. Source 19. The Meiri offers one factor we might consider when thinking about balancing between ethnicity and religion. And what the Meiri does, in short, is to set a one generation limit on the principle of being a Jew by blood. The Meiri says someone who converts to another religion doesn't matter. They remain a Jew. They're totally a Jew. They cannot take that off. That's a non-negotiable piece of who they are. However, he says, Uveno miha harehu goy gamur. However, his son is a bona fide Gentile. That is to say, the Meiri would have none of this. Two Jews convert to Christianity, raise a Christian child, we're going to call that kid a Jew. The Meiri said, I may have to deal with the fact that my covenantal blood ethnic notion of Judaism means anyone born as a Jew fundamentally can't have that taken away from them. But the religious identity piece of halakha might say, let's make certain judgments for those people and be willing to revisit how we look at the following generation. That's one factor that might be useful in constructing a conversation around this topic. The second is in source 20, a way of thinking about the different aspects of Jewish identity as potentially playing out in different ways with different rules, as opposed to imagining that a person must, for all purposes, be treated as a Jew, or for all purposes be treated as a Gentile. Maybe there's actually a way of subdividing the very identity that we're dealing with here that is complex. A question is asked of Rav Sadia Gaon back in the 9th century about a woman's husband who goes to a distant land, and the apostate violates Shabbat in public and has a son with her, and it's the levirate marriage case all over again. And he's analyzing here the basic question of how do we deal with the status of this person. If you go to the second paragraph here, in the third line of the second paragraph of source 20 in the English, he lays out what I think is a fascinating and thought-provoking rule. There are two aspects to the status of an apostate. One, with regard to ritual matters and things relating to mitzvot, we see if the person observes Shabbat. You want to know if someone counts in a minyan? See if they do anything to do with ritual law. Do they ever daven? Do they ever have a ritual life such that this fits in totally with what their identity is? But two, with respect to marriage, divorce, and personal status, we see if the person was conceived and born as a Jew, in which case the person affects Jewish marriage and divorce, creates and severs a levirate bond, and his children from relationships with no possibility of wedlock are mamzerim. You want to ask about a person's family status? Look at their family status. What kind of family were they born into? Isn't that the barometer that it makes sense to look at when you're considering questions of family law? Rav Sadia Gaon, I think, opens up something else that's interesting here, which is to play out even further than just his two possibilities here. What does it look like to take seriously the different components of what it means to be a Jew and to sort of assess the religious identity piece one by one? And finally, a source that I won't go into in great depth, but in source 22, Rav Yaakov ibn Habib addresses the question of whether the descendants of Marranos, conversos, should be treated the same as the descendants of those who willingly and electively adopted Christian practices. And he lays out a fascinating distinction, saying, the children of those who adopt, electively leave Judaism, their issue is no longer Jewish. Another version of the Meiri's position. However, someone who became a Gentile under duress retains their ethnic bloodline in perpetuity forever. And what I think that is an interesting way of thinking about these issues with is what would it look like to ask some of these questions of identity with the distinguishing lens of things that are being done through some degree of cultural coercion, cultural limitation that binds a person in, and what are the things that really reflect a person's elective choices to go to a different place than where they came from, and that being another way of playing this out. I think in closing we're going to need to come to terms with the fact that just like, in physics, mass and energy are inextricably linked in their conservation because of mass energy equivalence, our attitudes to conversion and apostasy affect and influence one another because of their shared mirror image engagement with the relative weights of ethnicity and religion. We can't keep having it both ways, as many of us do in America, where we insist that anyone born a Jew is a member of the tribe irrespective of their Jewish decisions, which is the ethnic identity model, while simultaneously wanting the complete and total acceptance of converts as equal to born Jews, which is the religious identity model. We cannot conversely maintain that bloodline is totally irrelevant when it comes to converts, and then be horrified that some people born as Jews electively decide, for all intents and purposes, to leave the Jewish people. The honest conversation about Jewish identity and these issues of choice will recognize that Rabbinic Judaism is a muddle, or perhaps a brilliant synthesis on this point, at once taking family and Torah seriously, and thus engaged in a constant struggle over which gets the upper hand when, recognizing that in a porous society with no perimeter around Jewish life, that struggle will often be a zero-sum game. Thank you. So we have some good time for questions. Can I get a pen just to take some notes? We'll do this as we did last time. Take a round of a few and try to answer them all at once. So I'm sure there's things on people's minds. Okay, so 1, 2, we got another one for this round, 3. Okay, yeah. a ger and a zar. Okay? Yes, Itamar.
So you presented the two models of ethnic and religious, but I think you just seem to assume that those should be applied equally on the way in and on the way out. It's like the doorway in and out needs to look the same. And I mean, I guess because you mentioned physics, if you look at biology and aspects of our body, the gateways in and out are totally different. I don't see why we should assume that we can't have it both ways.
Okay. Alan?
It's more just my question, much more eloquently than I was going to.
Okay, great. We have another one. I know someone else wants to get in this round. Yeah.
So to the source that said that converts should say Elokeinu, Elokeinu, what would they have said that somebody who was Jewish matrilineally would say? And what would the response be to that? And what could we learn from that? Would that be applicable? Or would they just pick a cop out and say, well, the maternal grandfather covers you?
Great. Okay. So let's take the two just sort of more technical question, and then we'll get to the more difficult theoretical question. Ger and zar are two biblical terms. Ger in the Bible refers to someone of a different ethnic group who is non-Israelite, who is hanging out with Israelites and is under their control, their political control in some way. That term then gets expanded, used, modified, however you want to read it, interpret it, by rabbinic sources to refer to someone who actually converts, which, by the way, is not as insane a stretch from that earlier extrapolation from the earlier model. That is to say, in an era of political sovereignty, the way you kind of clearly come into the group is by living in the sovereign territory of the group. It's not an unreasonable extension to say when that polity is sort of politically more dispossessed or less clearly defined, then the way it's monitored is through either some combination of bodily and practical commitment. But that's ger. Zar just refers to an Israelite who's not a Kohen, who is coming into places where they should not be and they should be kept out. So it's a sort of, you can think of these sort of concentric circles, right? There's the Kohanim, or sort of the purest Jews by blood that there can be on the inside. There's then Zarim, who are outside of that but still within the people. Then there's Gerim, who are able to come in but who actually began on the outside of that group. Now, as far as matrilineal, that's actually explicitly the next line in the Mishnah. I didn't go into it so as not to complicate. But the Mishnah says, V'im haita imo mi Yisrael mevi v'koreh. So, meaning even though he's patrilineally descended from a ger, from a convert, and in that sense, like a Kohen would carry that patrilineal quality, that essence, so too that's a notion of hereditary convert status. If there's sort of any path, right, back to Jewish lineage, then the problem goes away, right? Exactly for the reason that you said, for that source. Obviously, Rabbi Yehuda short-circuited this whole thing and said, no, Avraham gets us around this whole thing. But for the sources that thought that way, that's the way they did. Okay, so I'm going to partially try to answer and maybe partially throw it back to either you or others in the room who might want to give voice to this. Look, is it possible to have one thing on the way in and on the way out? I mean, on some level, that's what we do, right? Meaning, if you actually wanted to take the honest take of what kind of basically emerges from the Shulchan Aruch, okay, what you would find there is that basically, yes, more or less, converts can become Jews, though with some of this serious residue in a lot of the legal material, right? We didn't even get into the fact that Rambam, with all of his beautiful language, last I checked in the Mishnah Torah, is still codifying all the things about converts not being able to marry Kohanim, et cetera, et cetera. So what's going on? And he changes his mind. What does he mean when he says we're the same exactly for everything, right? So, okay, but there's more of, let's say, an acceptance of converts and a little less of a take in terms of apostates really being able to kind of legally exit. So I would say two things to you. One of my claims is that I think that's fundamentally theologically unstable. Like, it may be a reality. It may be the way it happens. I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's really possible. I mean, let's put it this way. I see it all the time, right? Meaning, many of you did this in the first lecture, right? The second I want to try to argue in some kind of passionate way for the power of Judaism as a religion of the body, people start with, yeah, but come on, what about the converts, right? I want to argue about use the language of Judaism of the body, Judaism of the people, the non-negotiable nature of it, to keep the apostates in. I think there's something unstable about once the converts are there of how much that's going to pass the straight face test as an overall principle. And so even if things have holding patterns, I'm not sure whether it's totally stable. Now this goes to your point of, maybe take your metaphor a little bit, the biological metaphor of what are the gateways in and out. Well, yeah, and one of the gateways in and out are the social gateways in and out. So in a world that saw Judaism from the outside as pretty ethnic, such that apostates are not going to have so much luck going out, right? I mean, this was the joke. This was the joke of the emancipation in Europe, right? It was a language of you can come right out. And it turned out in reality that was a total farce, because Christian Europe saw the Jews as ethnically other at the end of the day. So if the outside thing is locking the apostates from really coming out, then it's sort of easy to say, yeah, we welcome the converts in, and even though theoretically there's a corollary of the apostates go out, but we know that's not really going to happen. The reason I'm doing this series is because one of the things I think is the crying need now is there's no gatekeepers going out anymore. It is now simple in the snap of a finger to apostatize without any opprobrium from the outside society and minimal opprobrium from within the society. And at that point, then all sorts of things kind of come on the table again. Now, I think one of the responses to that reality of that porousness on the way out is actually just to advocate for total porousness. Now, that's part of why I started with what we did last week, which is to try to lay out what's some of what's lost with that. And what I tried to call our attention to with the apostasy piece here is, if the porousness is going to happen, and if people are in fact going to leave, there reaches a point where I'm not sure it makes any sense to claim people as Jewish who are with their feet acting that they're not. Now, where we're really going to get sticky with this, which is what I didn't really address at all, is what's that line, right? What's the barometer? You see a lot of these sources that talk about like public Shabbat desecration, right? Well, one of the first things that some of the major modern poskim do is they say, wait a minute, I'm not sure that's the line anymore. Because with that line, first of all, 90% of the people are going to be gone. And second of all, it actually probably doesn't capture what that category meant, which wasn't a fetishization of Shabbat per se, but reflected the fact that in a more insular Jewish society, breaking Shabbat in public was essentially to give the finger to the Jewish community and say, I don't care about your norms. Rav David Tzvi Hoffman and many others recognize that in the contemporary world, actually Jews who have non-rabbinic Shabbat practices are kind of just going along with the flow. They're not committing an act of rebellion, and therefore you might, if the category doesn't really mean Shabbat desecration, but really means rebellion, you then have to kind of figure out, well, what is that act? Now, 30 years ago, that act was intermarriage. That was like the agreed upon act. That was the thing that like, that basically took you out. That now is also up on the chopping block, right? That also is now not anymore considered to be, there's both the losing 90% of the people factor, but there's also a grappling with post-ethnic identity reality, etc. I don't particularly like love or feel comfortable with that shift, but it is a reality. So I don't know. We have to talk about it more. And if there's other thoughts on that, I welcome them, because as you see, I'm in process. Other thoughts and questions? We'll take another round. Yeah. Go to these three. Yeah.
Who was converting to Judaism in like the times of the Crusades?
Good. Okay. Yeah. No, it's good. It's good. We're gonna. Yeah. Yeah. Norm.
I'm not sure if this is a question. I'd like you to talk more about source 22. So I can't remember the name of the child who was stolen from the Jewish family in Italy by the Pope. Right. So there was a stolen child who was born Jewish, who was essentially coerced away from Judaism. How is that different than a child who's born to Jewish parents who may have apostatized, but who essentially was not raised Jewish and therefore was essentially stolen by his own parents away from Judaism? Or her?
Good. I actually think I have a good answer to that. So, okay, good. Good question. Yeah, okay. Yes?
Besides the two, the religious and the ethnicity, is there a third option for secular or for peoplehood or for civilization or whatever you want to call it?
Reconstructionist Judaism, do I hear? No, I'm joking. I'm just joking, just joking. Okay. Yeah, please, go ahead.
The one place I think that apostasy is still taken most seriously and the biggest challenge is in terms of the law of return. In Israel, the brother Daniel case is the example.
Correct. Correct. Okay, good. There's some good stuff we got to get into here. Who's converting in the times of the Crusades? Fairly frum people, right? Meaning people who are really convinced that they've actually stumbled onto a deeper truth than Christianity, right? The point behind your question is it wouldn't have been a sort of low-key, nonchalant choice because that's the cool place to be. And there are, in one of the sources that reevaluates, I mean, one of the most incredible, like, moving passages I've ever seen in the Tosafot is Rabbi Chelbo's statement in the Gemara that says converts are like a skin rash. And you have this long Tosafot that's everyone trying to sort of interpret what does this mean, and some like call it like it is, and others are doing different apologetics. And one of the reasons that I mentioned to you is offered by Rabbeinu Avraham Hager, Rabbeinu Avraham the convert, right? And it's like, I mean, it's so amazing on so many levels. Now, first of all, that this guy converted because of your point. Second, that he becomes a rabbi, right? Third, he becomes like one of the Balei HaTosafot, right? And fourth, which is on some of the most amazing thing, he is somehow able to look at a text that is on its surface spitting in his face and somehow have enough ownership of his Jewish identity to say, no, I can't mean that. It's got to mean this in a way that's actually to my favor. So I don't want to say Rabbeinu Avraham Hager is the paradigm of everyone who converted, but he's a good example of some of what you got at that time. As opposed to, of course, in the other direction, the people who are apostatizing are people like Rabbeinu Gershom's son. That is to say, the pressure to leave is pretty high. And someone who is not feeling comfortable as an heir of the tradition or who is not able to just sort of blend into that Jewish society and sees a way out will take it. And the Christians will overall be happy to have him. So yeah, others can comment with more expertise than I can about the fuller picture there, but you are correct that it's a small number, at least in that part of the world. By the way, that's not the same in the world of Chazal, right? As you see from Paul, right? Paul actually has a vision of, we could actually get a lot of people for this if, as my Zaidi always said, he was a brilliant marketer because he was like, it's too many mitzvot here. Just like get rid of, 611 or so of them, and then people will sign on, right? But the idea being that that was a time when there was much more porousness, okay? Now, as far as the question of, isn't the child of an apostate, of two apostates, effectively coerced? That might be true, but I think this is what Rabbi Ibn Habib is saying here is, we don't always or only consider the identity of a person, and certainly of a Jew, based on their perception and their narrative of what that story is. So even though that person at the end of the day could plausibly say, well, I don't know, I had this bloodline and who knew it was taken away from me? I should be able to come back to it. What I think he would say back to you is, yeah, but you only have that bloodline by dint of your parents, and they decided to sever it. Right? That is to say, when they decided before your birth to drop being Jewish, they effectively surrendered their ability to pass that on. Now that's not the Beit Yosef's reading, right? The Beit Yosef's reading is, that's it, you find that line, that one drop of Jewish blood, and you're back in the picture. But this is an attempt to sort of balance and say, look, it's one thing, like someone themselves never had it taken away from them. It remains live as a kind of ethnic force that they pass on. But someone who electively got rid of it, how do I sensibly bequeath that to the next generation without making a kind of a farce of it? So then I think he would say they are Jewish. Right? I think that's the whole point. This whole notion of whether, hora tova leidato b'kedusha, like does both the conception and the birth happen in a Jewish state, as it were, that matters. So that, I think, would be his answer. I hope that sort of addressed it. That's what I think he would answer. And obviously, the Beit Yosef would come back and hit him and say, I don't think that's how it works. But again, that's why I offered him as one of these interesting synthetic points that balances. Now, as far as the third way, look, I think peoplehood is just ethnicity. I mean, I think. Unless peoplehood is like code for pro-Israel, in which case it's just a different religious definition of Judaism, where the apostasy is to be an anti-Zionist. Right? So I'm not sure it's possible to escape this category. What I think is very much on the table is, with the religious identity piece, what is that? What is the contemporary Chilul Shabbat B'Farhesia? Right? I think for a lot of contemporary Jews, they would say it's some combination of anti-Zionism, Holocaust denial, and Jews for Jesus. No, am I wrong? Right? I mean, those are like the three. It used to be murder, idolatry, sex, right? Those are the three ones now, right? So there is some level on which we actually, if we push hard, right, I'm not sure we don't all have actually our apostasies. It's just they don't map so comfortably for some of us onto rabbinic texts, so we think, oh, we don't like the category of apostasy. But really, like, I don't know, would you treat a kid of yours who converted to Christianity the same way as a kid of yours who converted to a Hamas brand of Islam? I think you probably wouldn't, and you'd probably be right. That is to say, there are different social consequences to that you are fundamental, right? Because you have to understand, part of what rabbinic culture looked at with idolatry, what they saw with idolatry, was not just, they saw this also, was not just what they felt was a false statement about the world and its God, but it was totally wrapped up with a completely corrupt and evil culture that they wanted no part of, which is, by the way most Jews looked at Christianity throughout the medieval and the early modern period. Right? It wasn't just their other. It was, these people are horrible. They torture people, they kill us, they have narratives that are about how we killed their God. It's what kind of culture does that? You asked your average Jew, I don't think there would have been this split of, well, they're lovely people, but theologically we have a big divide, right? And that's the other reason you want to ask Itamar, why else are things porous? Well, part of the reason is Jews have, thank God, a positive opinion of the Gentile culture, for the most part, that we live in. Now, I think part of the question is, right, there's that for the most part, and on what points? And therein will lie also your definitions of apostasy. So I'm not sure, Moshe, I hear your point, but I think I would just push us back into the definitional argument of what are our apostasies, and of course, the flip side of it, which isn't really the topic of this series, but bubbles under the surface, what are our standards for conversion? Right, which is the other way. And obviously, look, I put my cards on the table with this repeatedly, I am invested both instinctively and programmatically in being completely within the rabbinic conversation. Right? I mean, obviously, the law of return, to the extent it's read as a Jewish identity document and not just a political strategy, is a modern non-rabbinic take on what Jewish identity should be. Right? And the interesting stuff going on in Israel now is, with Rabbanei Tzohar and other kind of rabbinic figures that are also deeply Zionist, trying to figure out what aspects of the rabbinic conversation are most sort of moldable and meshable with that new reality. Okay, we have time for maybe just like 2 or 3 final ones. Yeah, Steve, Ross.
Before the Exodus, the history was definitely familial. And then after that, there was a religious experience and a condemnation. But within the right on the spot, which introduces that concept of people who are not part of the family, but then are there for the religious part. So it seems to me that there's a precedent for that muddy, that murkiness.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
I have a question about the fifth source.
Yeah.
I'm kind of wondering, like, the language is really vague, as you pointed out. There's like a lot of emphasis on Abraham, and you pointed to some close to the divine presence. Is there a difference between us and this? I wonder if he's actually kind of making space in this conversation, actually not really distinguish someone being a Jew or not being Jewish, but actually just being a practicing monotheist. So when you think you're making mistakes with that here.
All right, so on the second question there, you should really ask Rav Shai Held, who has actually done some work on this specific passage and thinking through some of those issues. Suffice it to say, there are readers of this text that say exactly what you say and say, this is actually the Rambam in a cryptic way, sort of putting his cards on the table, that at the end of the day, like what it's really about is sort of philosophical transcendent monotheism. And all of the things that might flow from that. But that's really on some level the essence. And the other stuff is almost like ethnic particularist commentary on that. And that there's a possibility of, some kind of unification of belief and the faiths around that point to the extent that they sign on to that. Okay, on some level this comes back to the classic debate of what do you do with Rambam's responsa and Rambam's work in the guide, as opposed to Rambam in the Mishneh Torah and his legal code? How much is one window dressing for the other, or how much are they really kind of competing things, right? I mean, a sort of cynical reading of this tshuva is, yeah, this is what you I actually remember hearing once in a yeshiva context, and I don't report this as a bad thing. It's just one nature of talking, which is, to say, so the teacher said, when you talk to a convert, you don't say, you can't marry a Kohen, right? You instead emphasize, oh, you're completely a full part of the Jewish people, et cetera, et cetera. When you talk to a Kohen, you might say, you have a very serious line. I mean, you can't marry converts or this and that, the other thing. You have to take that very seriously, right? The notion of saying different things to different people because they need to hear different things. Rav Ovadia Ager in this text may need to hear some very lofty language. You could say Rambam is sort of deliberately going over the top to say what needs to be said. I don't know. It's a point that's worth probing more further, because the other thing is, it's not like the Rambam's theory of apostasy as plays out in the Mishneh Torah is as dramatic and open as I'm arguing it ought to be based on this model. And that's why I tried to be careful in my presentation to really talk about these as strands of thought that run through that I think at the end of the day are how we have to attack this. But then you want to get into each text in its historical context, it's going to be a lot richer and more complicated. Now, as far as the Erev Rav, look, the Erev Rav, and this will end, the Erev Rav is one example, as is the ger itself, right? Meaning the mixed multitudes, these people who are hanging out, and the stranger itself. There's clearly people there, right? There's clearly people who are somehow not Israelites, but are part of Israelite society and has to take account of them. The Erev Rav, I think, is a great example where, Rashi uses the Erev Rav as the punching bag, the exegetical punching bag for everything that goes wrong in the rest of the desert narrative. So he says, every time it says, the people did such and such thing, well, yeah, that's the Erev Rav, right? The Jews were actually fine, but they would never have built a golden calf. It was these people who were never bought into the project in the first place, right? And that, I think, is maybe a good example of the ways in which people are suspicious of newcomers. Right? I don't know how it could be otherwise. I mean, I can't imagine you have almost any association or institutional framework in your life in which there is not some degree of suspicion or waiting around to see with a newcomer. New hires to a job have a performance review, relatively shorter after they're hired than they will between their first and their second review. Right? That is to say, there's an aspect of when you take people on to a mission, and there's other people who have been there before, how is that going to play out? Obviously, the more the ethnic pole dominates here, the more that's going to be aggravated. And I would say the main thing I want you to take away from the sources that we've seen, I said this in the last line, is I do think that at least in the contemporary reality, we have to be conscious of the ways in which these two models do engage in some degree of zero-sum game. And it's not possible to seriously take a meaningful step towards one of them without taking a meaningful step away from the other. We'll leave it at that and continue next week with religious syncretism.